Chapter 7. Vance reaches a conclusion. Saturday, April 2nd, 3:30 p.m. When we were again alone in the drawing room, Vance rose and, stretching himself, went to the window. The scene that had just been enacted, with its startling climax, had left us all somewhat dazed. Our minds were busy, I think, with the same idea. And when Vance spoke, it was as if he were voicing our thoughts. "We're back in the nursery, it seems." "Aye," said the sparrow. "With my bow and arrow, I killed Cock Robin. I say, Markham, this is getting a bit thick." He came slowly back to the centre table and crushed out his cigarette. From the corner of his eye, he looked at Heath. "Why so pensive, Sergeant? You should be singing roundelays and doing a joyous tarantella. Has not your villain confessed to the dark deed? Does it not fill you with gladness to know that the culprit will soon be languishing in an oubliette?" "To tell you the truth, Mr. Vance," Heath admitted sullenly, "I'm not satisfied. That confession came too easy. And, well, I've seen a lot of guys come across, but this one somehow didn't act like he was guilty. And that's a fact, sir." "At any rate," submitted Markham hopefully, "his preposterous confession will damp the newspaper's curiosity and give us a free field to push our investigation. This case is going to make an ungodly noise. But as long as the reporters think the guilty person is jailed, they won't be bothering us for news of developments." "I'm not saying he ain't guilty," asserted Heath pugnaciously, obviously arguing against his own convictions. "We certainly had the goods on him, and he might have realized it and spilled the works, thinking it would go easier with him at the trial. Maybe he's not so dumb after all." "It won't do, Sergeant," said Vance. The lad's mental workings were deucedly simple. He knew Robin was waiting to see Miss Dillard, and he also knew she'd non-suited him, so to speak, last night. Spurling evidently didn't have a high opinion of Robin, and when he heard of the gentleman's death at the hands of someone who wielded a short, light bow, he jumped to the conclusion that Robin had overstepped the bounds of propriety in his wooing and received a righteous shaft through the heart. There was then nothing for our noble, mid-Victorian sparrow to do but slap his own manly bosom and proclaim, "Exe homo." It's most distressing. "Well, anyhow," grumbled Heath, "I'm not going to turn him loose. If Mr. Markham don't want to prosecute, that's up to him." Markham looked at the sergeant tolerantly. He realized the strain the man was under, and it was in keeping with his bigness of nature that he took no offence at the other's words. "Perhaps, however, Sergeant," he said kindly, "you'll not object to continuing the investigation with me, even if I don't decide to prosecute Spurling." Heath was at once contrite. He got up briskly and, going to Markham, held out his hand. "You know it, sir." Markham took the offered hand and rose with a gracious smile. "I'll leave things with you, then, for the time being. I've some work to do at the office, and I told Swacker to wait for me." 13. He moved dispiritedly toward the hall. "I'll explain the situation to Miss Dillard and the professor before I go. Anything special in mind, Sergeant?" "Well, sir, I think I'll take a good look for that rag that was used to wipe up the floor downstairs. And while I'm at it, I'll go over the archery room with a fine-tooth comb. Also, I'll put the screws to the cook and the butler again, especially the cook. She must have been mighty close at hand when the dirty work was going on. Then the regular routine stuff, inquiries in the neighborhood, and that sort of thing. Let me know the results. I'll be at the Stuyvesant Club later today and tomorrow afternoon." Vance had joined Markham in the archway. "I say, old man," he remarked, as we went toward the stairs, "don't minimize the importance of that cryptic note left in the mailbox. I've a strong psychic suspicion that it may be the key to the nursery. You'd better ask Professor Dillard and his niece if Bishop has any provocative significance for them. That diocesan signature has a meaning." "I'm not so sure," returned Markham dubiously. "It appears utterly meaningless to me, but I'll follow your suggestion." Neither the professor nor Miss Dillard, however, could recall any personal association with the word bishop, and the professor was inclined to agree with Markham that the note was without any significant bearing on the case. It strikes me, he said, as a piece of juvenile melodrama. It isn't likely that the person who killed Robin would adopt a vague pseudonym and write notes about his crime. I'm not acquainted with criminals, but such conduct doesn't impress me as logical. But the crime itself was illogical, ventured Vance pleasantly. One can't speak of a thing being illogical, sir, returned the professor tartly, when one is ignorant of the very premises of a syllogism. Exactly. Vance's tone was studiously courteous. Therefore, the note itself may not be without logic. Markham tactfully changed the subject. What I came particularly to tell you, Professor, is that Mr. Spurling called a short time ago and, when informed of Mr. Robin's death, confessed to having done it himself. Raymond confessed, gasped Miss Dillard. Markham looked at the girl sympathetically. To be quite frank, I didn't believe Mr. Spurling. Some mistaken idea of chivalry undoubtedly led him to admit the crime. Chivalry, she repeated, leaning forward tensely. What exactly do you mean by that, Mr. Markham? It was Vance who answered. The bow that was found on the range was a woman's bow. Oh! The girl covered her face with her hands, and her body shook with sobs. Professor Dillard regarded her helplessly, and his impotency took the form of irritation. What flummery is this, Markham? He demanded. Any archer can shoot with a woman's bow. That unutterable young idiot. Why should he make Belle miserable by his preposterous confession? Markham, my friend, do what you can for the boy. Markham gave his assurances, and we rose to go. By the by, Professor Dillard, said Vance, pausing at the door, I trust you won't misunderstand me, but there's a bare possibility that it was someone with access to this house who indulged in the practical joke of typing that note. Is there, by any chance, a typewriter on the premises? It was patent that the professor resented Vance's question, but he answered civilly enough. No, nor has there ever been one to my knowledge. I threw my own machine away 10 years ago when I left the university. An agency does whatever typing I need. And Mr. Arneson? He never uses a typewriter. As we descended the stairs, we met Arneson returning from Drucker's. I've placated our local Leibniz, he announced, with an exaggerated sigh. Poor old Adolf. The world is too much with him. When he's wallowing in the relativist formulas of Lorentz and Einstein, he's serene. But when he's dragged down to actuality, he disintegrates. It may interest you to know, said Vance casually, that Spurling has just confessed to the murder. Ha! Arneson chuckled. Quite in keeping. Aye, said the Sparrow. Very neat. Still, I don't know how it'll work out mathematically. And, since we agreed to keep you posted, continued Vance, it may help your calculations to know that we have reason to believe that Robin was killed in the archery room and placed on the range afterwards. Glad to know it. Arneson became momentarily serious. Yes, that may affect my problem. He walked with us to the front door. If there's any way I can be of service to you, call on me. Vance had paused to light a cigarette, but I knew by the languid look in his eyes that he was making a decision. Slowly, he turned to Arneson. Do you know if Mr. Drucker or Mr. Pardee has a typewriter? Arneson gave a slight start, and his eyes twinkled shrewdly. Aha! That bishop note. I see. Merely a matter of being thorough. Quite right. He nodded with satisfaction. Yes, both have typewriters. Drucker types incessantly, thinks to the keyboard, so he says, and Pardee's chess correspondence is as voluminous as a movie hero's. Types it all himself, too. Would it be any great trouble to you, asked Vance, to secure a specimen of the typing of each machine, and also a sample of the paper these two gentlemen use? None whatever. Arneson appeared delighted with the commission. Have them for you this afternoon. Where'll you be? Mr. Markham will be at the Stuyvesant Club. You might phone him there, and he can arrange. Why bother to arrange anything? I'll bring my findings to Mr. Markham personally. Only too glad. Fascinating game, being a sleuth. Vance and I returned home in the district attorney's car, and Markham continued to the office. At 7 o'clock that night, the three of us met at the Stuyvesant Club for dinner, and at 8:30 we were sitting in Markham's favourite corner of the lounge room, smoking and having our coffee. During the meal, no mention of the case had been made. The late editions of the afternoon papers had carried brief accounts of Robin's death. Heath had evidently succeeded in curbing the reporters' curiosity and clipping the wings of their imagination. The district attorney's office being closed, the newspaper men were unable to bombard Markham with questions, and so the late press was inadequately supplied with information. The sergeant had guarded the Dillard house well, for the reporters had not succeeded in reaching any member of the household. Markham had picked up a late Sun on his way from the dining room and glanced through it carefully as he sipped his coffee. "This is the first faint echo," he commented ruefully. "I shudder to think what the morning papers will contain." "There's nothing to do but bear it," smiled Vance unfeelingly. "The moment some bright journalistic lad awakes to the Robin Sparrow-Arrow combination, the city editors will go mad with joy, and every front page in the country will look like a Mother Goose hoarding." Markham lapsed into despondency. Finally, he struck the arm of his chair angrily with his fist. "Damn it, Vance! I won't let you inflame my imagination with this idiocy about nursery rhymes." Then he added, with the ferocity of uncertainty, "It's a sheer coincidence, I tell you. There simply couldn't be anything in it." Vance sighed. "Convince yourself against your will. You're of the same opinion still. To paraphrase Butler." He reached into his pocket and took out a sheet of paper. "Putting all juvenilia to one side pro tempore, here's an edifying chronology I drew up before dinner." "Edifying? Well, it might be if we knew how to interpret it." Markham studied the paper for several minutes. What Vance had written down was this: 9 a.m. Arneson left house to go to University Library. 9:15 a.m. Belle Dillard left house for the tennis courts. 9:30 a.m. Drucker called at house to see Arneson. 9:50 a.m. Drucker went downstairs to archery room. 10 a.m. Robin and Sperling called at house and remained in drawing room for half an hour. 10:30 a.m. Robin and Sperling went down to archery room. 10:32 a.m. Drucker says he went out for a walk by the wall gate. 10:35 a.m. Beadle went marketing. 10:55 a.m. Drucker says he returned to his own house. 11:15 a.m. Sperling went away by Wallgate. 11:30 a.m. Drucker says he heard a scream in his mother's room. 11:35 a.m. Professor Dillard went on balcony of Arneson's room. 11:40 a.m. Professor Dillard saw Robin's body on archery range. 11:45 a.m. Professor Dillard telephoned to District Attorney's office. 12:25 p.m. Belle Dillard returned from tennis. 12:30 p.m. Police arrived at Dillard House. 12:35 p.m. Beadle returned from market. 2 p.m. Arneson returned from university. Ergo, Robin was killed at some time between 11:15, when Sperling departed, and 11:40, when Professor Dillard discovered body. The only other persons known to have been in the house during this time were Pine and Professor Dillard. The disposition of all other persons connected in any way with the murder was as follows, according to statements and evidence now in hand. First, Arneson was at the University Library between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. 2. Belle Dillard was at the tennis courts between 9:15 a.m. and 12:25 p.m. Third, Drucker was walking in the park between 10:32 a.m. and 10:55 a.m. and was in his study from 10:55 a.m. on. Fourth, Pardee was in his house the entire morning. Eindam Mrs. Drucker was in her room the entire morning. Sixth, Beadle was marketing between 10:35 a.m. and 12:35 p.m. Seventh, Sperling was on his way to the Grand Central Station between 11:15 a.m. and 11:40 a.m., at which hour he took a train for Scarsdale. Conclusion: unless at least one of these 7 alibis is shaken, The whole weight of suspicion, and indeed the actual culpability, must rest upon either Pine or Professor Dillard. When Markham finished reading the paper, he made a gesture of exasperation. "Your entire implication is preposterous," he said irritably, "and your conclusion is a non sequitur. The chronology helps set the time of Robin's death, but your assumption that one of the persons we've seen today is necessarily guilty is arrant nonsense. You completely ignore the possibility that any outsider could have committed the crime. There were three ways of reaching the range and the archery room without entering the house: the wall gate on 75th Street, the other wall gate on 76th Street, and the alleyway between the two apartment houses leading to Riverside Drive." "Oh, it's highly probable that one of these three entrances was used," returned Vance. "But don't overlook the fact that the most secluded, and therefore the most likely, of these three means of entry, to wit, the alleyway, is guarded by a locked door to which no one would be apt to have a key except some member of the Dillard household. I can't picture a murderer walking into the range from either of the street gates. He would be taking too many chances of being seen." Vance leaned forward seriously. "And, Markham, there are other reasons why we may eliminate strangers or casual prowlers. The person who sent Robin to his maker must have been privy to the exact state of affairs in the Dillard house this morning, between 11:15 and 20 minutes to 12. He knew that Pine and the old professor were alone there. He knew that Belle Dillard was not roaming about the premises. He knew that Beadle was away and could neither hear him nor surprise him. He knew that Robin, his victim, was there, and that Spurling had departed. Moreover, he knew something of the lie of the land, the situation of the archery room, for instance. For it's only too plain that Robin was killed in that room. No one who wasn't familiar with all these details would have dared enter the grounds and staged a spectacular murder. I tell you, Markham, it was someone very close to the Dillard ménage, someone who was able to find out just what conditions obtained in that household this morning." "What about that scream of Mrs. Drucker's?" "Ah, what about it, indeed? Mrs. Drucker's window may have been a factor that the murderer overlooked. Or perhaps he knew about it and decided to take that one chance of being seen. On the other hand, we don't know whether the lady screamed or not. She says no, Drucker says yes. They both have an ulterior motive for what they poured into our trusting ears. Drucker may have told of the scream by way of proving he was at home between 11 and 12, and Mrs. Drucker may have denied it for fear he wasn't home. It's very much of an olla podrida. But it doesn't matter. The main point I'm trying to make is that only an intimate of the Dillard house could have done this devilish business." "We have too few facts to warrant that conclusion," asserted Markham. "Chance may have played a part." "Oh, I say, old man, chance may work out to a few permutations, but not to 20, and there is that note left in the mailbox. The murderer even knew Robin's middle name. Assuming, of course, that the murderer wrote the note." "Do you prefer to assume that some balmy joker found out about the crime through telepathy or crystal gazing, hied to a typewriter, composed a dithyramb, returned hot-footed to the house, and, for no good reason, took the terrific risk of being seen putting the paper in the mailbox?" Before Markham could answer, Heath entered the lounge room and hurried to our corner. That he was worried and uneasy was obvious. With scarcely a word of greeting, he handed a typewritten envelope to Markham. "That was received by the World in the late afternoon mail. Queen Anne, the police reporter of the World, brought it to me a little while ago, and he says that the Times and the Herald also got copies of it. The letters were stamped at 1 o'clock today, so they were probably posted between 11 and 12. What's more, Mr. Markham, they were mailed in the neighborhood of the Dillard house, for they went through Post Office Station N on West 69th Street. Markham withdrew the enclosure from the envelope. Suddenly his eyes opened wide, and the muscles about his mouth tightened. Without looking up, he handed the letter to Vance. It consisted of a single sheet of typewriting paper, and the words printed on it were identical to those on the note left in the Dillard mailbox. Indeed, the communication was an exact duplicate of the other. "Joseph Cochrane Robin is dead. Who killed Cock Robin? Spurling means sparrow. The bishop. Vance scarcely glanced at the paper. "Quite in keeping, don't you know?" he said indifferently. The bishop was afraid the public might miss the point of his joke, so he explained it to the press. "Joke, did you say, Mr. Vance?" asked Heath bitterly. "It ain't the kind of joke I'm used to. This case gets crazier." "Exactly, Sergeant. A crazy joke." A uniformed boy stepped up to the district attorney and, bending over his shoulder discreetly, whispered something. "Bring him here right away," ordered Markham. Then to us, "It's Arneson. He'll probably have those specimens of typing." A shadow had settled on his face, and he glanced again at the note Heath had brought him. "Vance," he said in a low voice, "I'm beginning to believe that this case may turn out to be as terrible as you think. I wonder if the typing will correspond." But when the note was compared with the specimens Arneson brought, no similarity whatever could be discerned. Not only were the typing and the ink different from those of either Pardey's or Drucker's machine, but the paper did not match any one of the samples that Arneson had secured. Chapter 8. Act 2. Monday, April 11th, 11:30 a.m. There is no need to recall here the nationwide sensation caused by Robin's murder. Everyone remembers how that startling tragedy was featured in the country's press. It was referred to by various designations. Some newspapers called it the Cock-Robin murder. Others, more alliterative but less accurate, 14 termed it the Mother Goose murder. But the signature of the typewritten notes appealed strongly to the journalistic sense of mystery. And in time, the killing of Robin came to be known as the Bishop murder case. Its strange and fearful combination of horror and nursery jargon inflamed the public's imagination, and the sinister and insane implications of its details affected the entire country like some grotesque nightmare whose atmosphere could not be shaken off. During the week following the discovery of Robin's body, the detectives of the Homicide Bureau, as well as the detectives connected with the district attorney's office, were busy night and day pushing their inquiries. The receipt of the duplicate Bishop notes by the leading New York morning papers had dissipated whatever ideas Heath may have held as to Sperling's guilt. And though he refused to put his official imprimatur on the young man's innocence, he threw himself, with his usual gusto and pertinacity, into the task of finding another and more plausible culprit. The investigation which he organized and superintended was as complete as had been that of the Green murder case. No avenue which held the meagerest hope of results was overlooked, and the report he drew up would have given joy even to those meticulous criminologists of the University of Lausanne. On the afternoon of the day of the murder, he and his men had searched for the cloth that had been used to wipe up the blood in the archery room, but no trace of it was found. Also, a thorough examination of the Dillard basement was made in the hope of finding other clues. But although Heath had put the task in the hands of experts, the result was negative. The only point brought to light was that the fibre rug near the door had recently been moved so as to cover the cleanse spot on the cement floor. This fact, however, merely substantiated the sergeant's earlier observation. The post-mortem report of Dr. Doremus lent colour to the now officially accepted theory that Robin had been killed in the archery room and then placed on the range. The autopsy showed that the blow on the back of his skull had been a particularly violent one and had been made with a heavy rounded instrument, resulting in a depressed fracture quite different from the fissured fracture caused by striking a flat surface. A search was instituted for the weapon with which the blow had been dealt, but no likely instrument was turned up. Though Beadle and Pine were questioned by Heath several times, nothing new was learned from them. Pine insisted that he had been upstairs the entire morning in Arneson's room, except for a few brief absences to the linen closet and the front door, and clung tenaciously to his denial that he had touched either the body or the bow when sent by Professor Dillard to find Sperling. The sergeant, however, was not entirely satisfied with the man's testimony. "That bleary-eyed old cormorant has got something up his sleeve," he told Markham disgustedly. "But it would take the rubber hose and the water cure to make him spill it." A canvass of all the houses in 75th Street between West End Avenue and Riverside Drive was made in the hope of finding a tenant who had noticed someone entering or emerging from the Dillard Wallgate during the forenoon. But nothing was gained by this tedious campaign. Pardee, it seemed, was the only resident within view of the Dillard house who had observed anyone in the neighborhood that morning. In fact, after several days of arduous inquiries along this line, the sergeant realized that he would have to proceed without any outside or fortuitous assistance. The various alibis of the 7 persons whom Vance had tabulated in his notation for Markham were gone into as thoroughly as circumstances would permit. It was obviously impossible to check them completely, for in the main they were based solely on the statements of the individuals involved. Moreover, the investigation had to be made with the utmost care lest suspicion be aroused. The results of these inquiries were as follows. First, Arneson had been seen in the university library by various people, including an assistant librarian and 2 students, but the time covered by their evidence was neither consecutive nor specific as to the hour. 2. Belle Dillard had played several sets of tennis at the public courts at 119th Street and Riverside Drive, but because there had been more than 4 in her party, she had twice relinquished her place to a friend, and none of the players could state positively that she had remained at the courts during these periods. 3. The time that Drucker departed from the archery room was definitely determined by Spurling, but no one could be found who had seen him thereafter. He admitted he had met no one he knew in the park, but insisted he had stopped for a few minutes to play with some strange children. 4. Pardee had been alone in his study. His old cook and his Japanese valet had been in the rear of the house and had not seen him until lunchtime. His alibi, therefore, was purely a negative one. Eindam Mrs. Drucker's word had to be accepted as to her whereabouts that morning, for no one had seen her between 9:30, when Drucker went to call on Arneson, and 1 o'clock, when the cook brought up her luncheon. 6th, Beadle's alibi was checked with fairly satisfactory completeness. Pardee had seen her leave the house at 10:35, and she was remembered by several of the hucksters at the Jefferson Market between 11 and 12. 7. The fact that Spurling had taken the 11:40 train to Scarsdale was verified. Therefore, he would have had to leave the Dillard house at the time he stated, namely 11:15. The determination of this point, however, was merely a matter of routine, for he had been practically eliminated from the case. But if, as Heath explained, it had been found that he had not taken the 11:40 train, he would have again become an important possibility. Pursuing his investigations along more general lines, the sergeant went into the histories and associations of the various persons involved. The task was not a difficult one. All were well known, and information concerning them was readily accessible. But not one item was unearthed that could be regarded as even remotely throwing any light on Robin's murder. Nothing transpired to give so much as a hint to the motive for the crime, and after a week's intensive inquiry and speculation, the case was still cloaked in seemingly impenetrable mystery. Spurling had not been released. The prima facie evidence against him, combined with his absurd confession, made impossible such a step on the part of the authorities. Markham, however, had held an unofficial conference with the attorneys whom Spurling's father had engaged to handle the case, and some sort of a gentleman's agreement had, I imagine, been reached, for although the state made no move to apply for an indictment, despite the fact that the grand jury was sitting at the time, the defense lawyers did not institute habeas corpus proceedings. All the indications pointed to the supposition that both Markham and Spurling's attorneys were waiting for the real culprit to be apprehended. Markham had had several interviews with the members of the Dillard household in a persistent effort to bring out some trivial point that might lead to a fruitful line of inquiry, and Pardee had been summoned to the district attorney's office to make an affidavit as to what he had observed from his window on the morning of the tragedy. Mrs. Drucker had been interrogated again, but not only did she emphatically deny having looked out of her window that morning, but she scoffed at the idea that she had screamed. Drucker, when re-questioned, modified somewhat his former testimony. He explained that he might have been mistaken as to the source of the scream and suggested that it could have come from the street or from one of the court windows of the apartment house. In fact, he said, it was highly unlikely that his mother had uttered the scream, for when he went to her door a moment later, she was humming an old German nursery song from Humperdinck's Hansel and Gretel. Markham, convinced that nothing further was to be learned from either him or Mrs. Drucker, finally concentrated on the Dillard house itself. Arneson attended the informal conferences held in Markham's office, but for all his voluble and cynical observations, he appeared to be as much at sea as the rest of us. Vance chaffed him good-naturedly about the mathematical formula that was to solve the case, but Arneson insisted that a formula could not be worked out until all the factors of the theorem were available. He appeared to regard the entire affair as a kind of Juvenalian lark, and Markham on several occasions gave vent to his exasperation. He reproached Vance for having made Arneson an unofficial confrere in the investigation, but Vance defended himself on the ground that sooner or later Arneson would supply some piece of seemingly irrelevant information that could be used as an advantageous point de départ. His crimino-mathematical theory is of course rubbish, said Vance. Psychology, not abstract science, will eventually reduce this conundrum to its elements. But we need material to go on, and Arneson knows the inwardness of the Dillard home better than we can ever know it. He knows the Druckers, and he knows Pardee, and it goes without saying that a man who has had the academic honours heaped on him that he has possesses an unusually keen mind. As long as he gives his thought and attention to the case, there's the chance that he'll hit upon something of vital importance to us. You may be right, grumbled Markham, but the man's derisive attitude gets on my nerves. Be more catholic, urged Vance. Consider his ironies in relation to his scientific speculations. What could be more natural than that a man who projects his mind constantly into the vast interplanetary reaches and deals with light years and infinities and hyperphysical dimensions should sniff derisively at the infinitesimals of this life? Stout fella, Arneson. Not homey and comfortable, perhaps, but dashed interesting. Vance himself had taken the case with unwanted seriousness. His Menander translations had been definitely put aside. He became moody and waspish, a sure sign that his mind was busy with an absorbing problem. After dinner each night, he went into his library and read for hours, not the classic and aesthetic volumes on which he generally spent his time, but such books as Bernard Hart's The Psychology of Insanity, Freud's Der Witz und seine Beziehung zum Unbewussten, Coriat's Abnormal Psychology, and Repressed Emotions, Lippo's Komik und Humor, Daniel A. Huebsches The Murder Complex, Janet's Les Obsessions et la Psychasthenie, Donat's Über Arithmomanie, Ricklin's Wish Fulfillment and Fairy Tales, Leppmans Die forensische Bedeutung der Zwangsvorstellungen, Kuno Fischers Über den Witz, Erich Wulffens Kriminalpsychologie, Hollandens The Insanity of Genius, and Gruse's Die Spiele des Menschen. He spent hours going over the police reports. He called twice at the Dillards, and on one occasion visited Mrs. Drucker in company with Belle Dillard. He had a long discussion one night with Drucker and Arneson on De Sitter's conception of physical space as a Lobachevskian pseudosphere, his object being, I surmised, to acquaint himself with Drucker's mentality. He read Drucker's book, World Lines in Multidimensional Continua, and spent nearly an entire day studying Janowski's and Tarash's analyses of the Pardee Gambit. On Sunday, 8 days after the murder of Robin, he said to me, "Eho, Van, this problem is unbelievedly subtle. No ordinary investigation will ever probe it. It lies in a strange territory of the brain, and its superficial childishness is its most terrible and baffling aspect. Nor is the perpetrator going to be content with a single coup. Cock Robin's death serves no definitive end. The perverted imagination that concocted this beastly crime is insatiable, and unless we can expose the abnormal psychological mechanism back of it, there will be more grim jokes to contend with." The very next morning his prognostication was verified. We went to Markham's office at 11 o'clock to hear Heath's report and to discuss further lines of action. Though 9 days had passed since Robin had been found murdered, no progress had been made in the case, and the newspapers had grown bitter in their criticisms of the police and the district attorney's office. It was therefore with considerable depression that Markham greeted us that Monday morning. Heath had not yet arrived, but when he came a few minutes later, it was obvious that he too was discouraged. "We run up against a brick wall, sir, every way we turn," he repined, when he had outlined the results of his men's activities. "There ain't a sign of a motive, and outside of Spurling, there's nobody on the landscape that we can hang anything on. I'm coming to the conclusion that it was some stick-up man who ambled into the archery room that morning and messed things up." "Stick-up men, Sergeant," countered Vance, "are deuced unimaginative, and they're without a sense of humour, whereas the Johnny who sent Robin on the long, long trail had both imagination and humour. He wasn't content merely to kill Robin, he had to turn the act into an insane joke. Then, lest the public wouldn't see the point, he wrote explanatory letters to the press. Does that sound like the procedure of an itinerant thug?" Heath smoked unhappily for several minutes without speaking, and at length turned a gaze of exasperated dismay upon Markham. "There's no sense in anything that's breaking round this town lately," he complained. "Just this morning a guy named Sprigg was shot in Riverside Park, up near 84th Street. Money in his pocket, nothing taken, just shot. Young fella, student at Columbia, lived with his parents, no enemies. Went out to take his usual walk before going to class. Found dead half an hour later by a bricklayer." The sergeant chewed viciously on his cigar. "Now we got that homicide to worry about, and we'll probably get hell from the newspapers if we don't clear it up pronto. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing to go on." "Still, Sergeant," said Vance consolingly, "shooting a man is an ordinary event. There are numerous commonplace reasons for that sort of crime. It's the scenic and dramatic appurtenances of Robin's murder that play havoc with all our processes of deduction. If only it wasn't a nursery affair." Suddenly he stopped speaking, and his eyelids drooped slightly. Leaning forward, he very deliberately crushed out his cigarette. "Did you say, Sergeant, that this chap's name was Sprigg?" Heath nodded gloomily. "And I say?" Despite Vance's effort, there was a note of eagerness in his tone. "What was his first name?" Heath gave Vance a look of puzzled surprise, but after a brief pause he drew forth his battered notebook and riffled the pages. "John Sprigg," he answered. "John E. Sprigg." Vance took out another cigarette and lighted it with great care. "And tell me, was he shot with a .32? "Huh?" Heath's eyes rounded, and his chin shot forward. "Yes, a .32 point. And was he shot through the top of his head?" The sergeant sprang to his feet and stared at Vance with ludicrous bewilderment. Slowly his head moved up and down. "That's right. But how in hell, sir?" Vance held up a silencing hand. It was, however, the look on his face, rather than his gesture, that cut short the query. "Oh, my precious aunt." He rose like a man in a daze and gazed fixedly before him. Had I not known him so well, I would have sworn he was frightened. Then, going to the tall window behind Markham's desk, he stood looking down on the grey stone walls of the tombs. "I can't credit it," he murmured. "It's too ghastly. But of course it's so." Markham's impatient voice sounded. "What's all this mumbling about, Vance? Don't be so damn mysterious. How did you happen to know that Sprigg was shot through the crown with a .32? And what's the point, anyway?" Vance turned and met Markham's eyes. "Don't you see?" he asked softly. "It's the second act of this devilish parody. Have you forgotten your mother goose?" And in a hushed voice that brought a sense of unutterable horror into that dingy old office, he recited, "There was a little man, and he had a little gun, and his bullets were made of lead, lead. He shot Johnny Sprigg through the middle of his wig and knocked it right off of his head. Chapter 9. The Tensor Formula, Monday, April 11th, 11:30 a.m. Markham sat staring at Vance like a man hypnotized. Heath stood rigid, his mouth partly open, his cigar held a few inches from his lips. There was something almost comic in the sergeant's attitude, and I had a nervous inclination to laugh, but for the moment my blood seemed frozen, and all muscular movement was impossible. Markham was the first to speak. Jerking his head backward, he brought his hand down violently on the desktop. "What new lunacy of yours is this?" He was fighting desperately against Vance's dumbfounding suggestion. "I'm beginning to think the Robin case has affected your mind. Can't a man with the commonplace name of Sprigg be shot without your trying to turn it into some grotesque hocus-pocus?" "Still, you must admit, Markham, old dear," returned Vance mildly, "this particular Johnny Sprigg was shot with a little gun through the middle of his wig, so to speak." "What if he was?" A dull flush had crept into Markham's face. "Is that any reason for your going about babbling Mother Goose rhymes?" "Oh, I say, I never babble, don't you know." Vance had dropped into a chair facing the district attorney's desk. "I may not be a thrilling elocutionist, but really now, I don't babble." He gave Heath an ingratiating smile. "Do I, Sergeant?" But Heath had no opinion to express. He still held his astonished pose, though his eyes had now become mere slits in his broad, pugnacious face. "Are you seriously suggesting—" began Markham, but Vance interrupted him. "Yes, I'm seriously suggesting that the person who killed Cock Robin with an arrow has vented his grim humour upon the hapless Sprigg. Coincidence is out of the question. Such repetitive parallels would knock the entire foundation out from all sanity and reason. 'Pon my soul, the world is mad enough, but such madness would dissipate all science and rational thinking. Sprigg's death is rather hideous, but it must be faced, and however much you may force yourself to protest against its incredible implications, you'll eventually have to accept them." Markham had risen and was pacing nervously up and down. "I'll grant there are inexplicable elements in this new crime." His combativeness had gone, and his tone had moderated. "But if we assume, even tentatively, that some maniac is at large reconstructing the rhymes of his nursery days, I can't see how it will help us. It would practically close all routine lines of investigation." "I shouldn't say that, don't you know." Vance was smoking meditatively. "I'm inclined to think that such an assumption would supply us with a definite basis of inquiry." "Sure," snapped Heath with ponderous sarcasm. "All we got to do is to go out and find one bug among 6 million people. A cinch." "Don't let the fumes of discouragement overcome you, Sergeant. Our elusive jester is a rather distinctive entomological specimen. Moreover, we have certain clues as to his exact habitat." Markham swung round. "What do you mean by that?" "Merely that this second crime is related to the first not only psychologically, but geographically. Both murders were committed within a few blocks of each other. Our destructive demon at least has a weakness for the neighborhood in which the Dillard house is situated. Furthermore, the very factors of the two murders preclude the possibility of his having come from afar to give rein to his distorted humor in unfamiliar surroundings. As I learnedly pointed out to you, Robin was translated into the beyond by someone who knew all the conditions obtaining at the Dillard house at the exact hour the grisly drama was performed. And surely it's obvious that this second crime could not have been so tidily staged had not the impresario been acquainted with Sprigg's ambulatory intentions this morning. Indeed, the entire mechanism of these weird playlets proves that the operator was intimately cognizant of all the circumstances surrounding his victims. The heavy silence that followed was broken by Heath. "If you're right, Mr. Vance, then that lets Spurling out." The sergeant made even this qualified admission reluctantly, but it showed that Vance's argument had not been without its effect on him. He turned desperately to the district attorney. "What do you think we'd better do, sir?" Markham was still battling against the acceptance of Vance's theory, and he did not answer. Presently, however, he reseated himself at his desk and drummed with his fingers upon the blotter. Then, without looking up, he asked, "Who's in charge of the Sprigg case, Sergeant?" "Captain Pitts. The local men at the 68th Street station grabbed it first, but when the news was relayed to the Bureau, Pitts and a couple of our boys went up to look into it. Pitts got back just before I came over here. Says it's a washout, but Inspector Moran 15 told him to stay with it." Markham pressed the buzzer beneath the edge of his desk, and Swacker, his youthful secretary, appeared at the swinging door that led to the clerical room between the district attorney's private office and the main waiting room. "Get Inspector Moran on the wire," he ordered. When the connection had been made, he drew the telephone toward him and spoke for several minutes. When he had replaced the receiver, he gave Heath a weary smile. "You're now officially handling the Sprigg case, Sergeant. Captain Pitts will be here presently, and then we'll know where we stand." He began looking through a pile of papers before him. "I've got to be convinced," he added half-heartedly, "that Sprigg and Robin are tied up in the same sack." Pitts, a short, stocky man with a lean, hard face and a black toothbrush moustache, arrived 10 minutes later. He was, I learned afterwards, one of the most competent men in the detective division. His specialty was white-collar gangsters. He shook hands with Markham and gave Heath a companionable leer. When introduced to Vance and me, he focused suspicious eyes on us and bowed grudgingly. But as he was about to turn away, his expression suddenly changed. "Mr. Philo Vance, is it?" he asked. "Alas, so it seems, Captain," Vance sighed. Pitts grinned, and stepping forward, held out his hand. "Glad to meet you, sir. Heard the sergeant speak of you often." "Mr. Vance is helping us unofficially with the Robin case, Captain," explained Markham. "And since this man Sprigg was killed in the same neighborhood, we thought we'd like to hear your preliminary report on the affair." He took out a box of Corona Perfectos and pushed it across the desk. "You needn't put the request that way, sir." The captain smiled, and selecting a cigar, held it to his nose with a kind of voluptuous satisfaction. "The inspector told me you had some ideas about this new case, and wanted to take it on. To tell you the truth, I'm glad to get rid of it." He sat down leisurely and lighted his cigar. "What would you like to know, sir?" "Let us have the whole story," said Markham. Pitts settled himself comfortably. "Well, I happened to be on hand when the case came through, a little after 8 this morning, and I took a couple of the boys and beat it uptown. The local men were on the job, and an assistant medical examiner arrived the same time I did." "Did you hear his report, Captain?" asked Vance. "Sure. Sprigg was shot through the top of the head with a .32. No signs of a struggle, no bruises or anything. Nothing fancy, just a straight shooting." "Was he lying on his back when found?" "That's right. Stretched out nice and pretty, right in the middle of the walk." "And wasn't his skull fractured where he'd fallen on the asphalt?" The question was put negligently. Pitts took his cigar from his mouth and gave Vance a sly look. "I guess maybe you fellows over here do know something about this case." He nodded his head sagaciously. "Yes, the back of the guy's skull was all bashed in. He sure had a tough fall, but I guess he didn't feel it. Not with that bullet in his brain. Speaking of the shot, Captain, didn't anything about it strike you as peculiar?" "Well, yes," Pitts admitted, rolling his cigar meditatively between his thumb and forefinger. "The top of a guy's head isn't where I'd ordinarily look for a bullet hole, and his hat wasn't touched. It must have fallen off before he was potted. You might call those facts peculiar, Mr. Vance." "Yes, Captain, they're dashed peculiar. And I take it the pistol was held at close range." "Not more than a couple of inches away. The hair was singed round the hole." He made a broad gesture of inconsequence. "Still and all, the guy might have seen the other fellow draw the gun and ducked forward, spilling his hat. That would account for his getting the shot at close range in the top of the head." Quite. Except that, in that case, he wouldn't have fallen over back, but would have pitched forward on his face. But go on with the story, Captain." Pitts gave Vance a look of crafty agreement and continued. "The first thing I did was to go through the fellow's pockets. He had a good gold watch on him and about $15 in bills and silver. So it didn't look like a robbery, unless the guy that shot him got panicky and beat it. But that didn't seem likely, for there's never anyone round that part of the park early in the morning, and the walk there dips under a stone bluff so that the view is cut off. The bird that did the job certainly picked a swell place for it. Anyhow, I left a couple of men to guard the body till the wagon came for it, and went up to Sprigg's house in 93rd Street. I'd got his name and address from a couple of letters in his pocket. I found out he was a student at Columbia, living with his parents, and that it was his habit to take a walk in the park after breakfast. He left home this morning about 7:30. Ah, it was his habit to promenade in the park each morning, murmured Vance. Most interesting. Even so, that don't get us anywheres, returned Pitts. Plenty of fellows take an early constitutional, and there was nothing unusual about Sprigg this morning. He wasn't worried about anything, his folks told me, and was cheerful enough when he said goodbye to 'em. After that, I hopped up to the university and made inquiries, talked to a couple of the students that knew him, and also to one of the instructors. Sprigg was a quiet sort of chap. Didn't make friends and kept pretty much to himself. Serious bird, always working at his studies. Stood high in his classes and was never seen going around with Janes. Didn't like women, in fact. Wasn't what you'd call sociable. From all reports, he was the last man to get in a mess of any kind. That's why I can't see anything special in his getting shot. It must have been an accident of some kind. Might have been taken for somebody else. And he was found at what time? About 7:45. A bricklayer on the new 79th Street dock was cutting across the embankment toward the railway tracks and saw him. He notified one of the post officers on the drive, who phoned in to the local station. And Sprigg left his home in 93rd Street at 7:30. Vance gazed at the ceiling meditatively. Therefore, he would have had just enough time to reach this point in the park before being killed. It looks as if someone who knew his habits was waiting for him. Neatness and dispatch. What? It doesn't appear exactly fortuitous, does it, Markham? Ignoring the jibe, Markham addressed Pitts. Was there nothing found that could possibly be used as a lead? No, sir. My men combed the spot pretty thoroughly, but nothing showed up. And in Sprigg's pockets, among his papers? Not a thing. I've got all the stuff at the bureau, a couple of ordinary letters, a few odds and ends of the usual kind. He paused as if suddenly remembering something and pulled out a dog-eared notebook. There was this, he said unenthusiastically, handing a torn triangular scrap of paper to Markham. It was found under the fellow's body. It don't mean anything, but I stuck it in my pocket. Force of habit. The paper was not more than 4 inches long and appeared to have been torn from the corner of an ordinary sheet of unruled stationery. It contained part of a typewritten mathematical formula with the lambda, the equals, and the infinity sign marked in with pencil. I reproduce the paper here, for despite its seeming irrelevancy, it was to play a sinister and amazing part in the investigation of Sprigg's death. Vance glanced only casually at the exhibit, but Markham held it in his hand, frowning at it for several moments. He was about to make some comment when he caught Vance's eye, and instead he tossed the paper to the desk carelessly with a slight shrug. Is this everything you found? That's all, sir. Markham rose. We're very grateful to you, Captain. I don't know what we'll be able to make out of this Sprigg case, but we'll look into it. He pointed to the box of perfectos. Put a couple in your pocket before you go. Much obliged, sir. Pitt selected the cigars and, placing them tenderly in his waistcoat pocket, shook hands with all of us. When he had gone, Vance got up with alacrity and bent over the scrap of paper on Markham's desk. My word! He took out his monocle and studied the symbols for several moments. Most alluring. Now, where have I seen that formula recently? Ah, the Riemann-Christoffel tensor, of course. Drucker uses it in his book for determining the Gaussian curvature of spherical and homoloidal space. But what was Sprigg doing with it? The formula is considerably beyond the college curricula. He held the paper up to the light. It's the same stock as that on which the bishop notes are written, and you probably observed that the typing is also similar. Heath had stepped forward and now scrutinized the paper. It's the same, all right. The fact seemed to nonplus him. That's a link anyway between the two crimes. Vance's eyes took on a puzzled look. A link? Yes. But the presence of the formula under Sprigg's body appears as irrational as the murder itself. Markham moved uneasily. You say it is a formula that Drucker uses in his book? Yes. But the fact doesn't necessarily involve him. The tensor is known to all advanced mathematicians. It is one of the technical expressions used in non-Euclidean geometry, and though it was discovered by Riemann in connection with a concrete problem in physics, 16 it has now become of widespread importance in the mathematics of relativity. It's highly scientific in the abstract sense, and can have no direct bearing on Sprigg's murder. He sat down again. Arneson will be delighted with the find. He may be able to work out some astonishing conclusion from it. I see no reason, protested Markham, to inform Arneson of this new case. My idea would be to keep it under cover as much as possible. The bishop won't let you, I fear, returned Vance. Markham set his jaw. Good God, he burst out. What damnable sort of thing are we facing? I expect every minute to wake up and discover I've been living a nightmare. No such luck, sir, growled Heath. He took a resolute breath like a man preparing for combat. What's on the cards? Where do we go from here? I need action. Markham appealed to Vance. You seem to have some idea about this affair. What's your suggestion? I frankly admit I'm floundering about in a black chaos. Vance inhaled deeply on his cigarette. Then he leaned forward as if to give emphasis to his words. Markham, old man, there's only one conclusion to be drawn. These two murders were engineered by the same brain. Both sprang from the same grotesque impulse, and since the first of them was committed by someone intimately familiar with conditions inside the Dillard house, it follows that we must now look for a person who, in addition to that knowledge, had definite information that a man named John Sprigg was in the habit of taking a walk each morning in a certain part of Riverside Park. Having found such a person, we must check up on the points of time, place, opportunity, and possible motive. There's some interrelation between Sprigg and the Dillards. What it is, I don't know, but our first move should be to find out. What better starting point than the Dillard house itself? We'll get some lunch first, said Markham wearily. Then we'll run out there. Chapter 10. A refusal of aid. Monday, April 11th, 2 p.m. It was shortly after 2 o'clock when we reached the Dillard house. Pine answered our ring, and if our visit caused him any surprise, he succeeded admirably in hiding it. In the look he gave Heath, however, I detected a certain uneasiness, but when he spoke his voice had the flat, unctuous quality of the well-trained servant. Mr. Arneson has not returned from the university, he informed us. Mind-reading, I see, said Vance, is not your forte, Pine. We called to see you and Professor Dillard. The man looked ill at ease, but before he could answer, Miss Dillard appeared in the archway of the drawing-room. I thought I recognized your voice, Mr. Vance. She included us all in a smile of wistful welcome. Please come in. Lady May dropped in for a few minutes. We're going riding together this afternoon, she explained as we entered the room. Mrs. Drucker stood by the centre table, one bony hand on the back of the chair from which she had evidently just risen. There was fear in her eyes as she stared at us unblinkingly, and her lean features seemed almost contorted. She made no effort to speak, but stood rigidly as if waiting for some dread pronouncement, like a convicted prisoner at the bar about to receive sentence. Belle Dillard's pleasant voice relieved the tensity of the situation. I'll run up and tell Uncle you're here. She had no sooner quitted the room than Mrs. Drucker leaned over the table and said to Markham in a sepulchral, awe-stricken whisper, I know why you've come. It's about that fine young man who was shot in the park this morning. So amazing and unexpected were her words that Markham could make no immediate answer, and it was Vance who replied. You have heard of the tragedy, then, Mrs. Drucker? How could the news have come to you so soon? A look of canniness came into the woman's expression, giving her the appearance of an evil old witch. Everyone is talking about it in the neighborhood, she answered evasively. Indeed. That's most unfortunate. But why do you assume we have come here to make inquiries about it? Wasn't the young man's name Johnny Sprigg? A faint, terrible smile accompanied the question. So it was. John E. Sprigg. Still, that does not explain his connection with the Dillards. Ah, but it does. Her head moved up and down with a sort of horrible satisfaction. It's a game, a child's game. First, Cock Robin. Then Johnny Sprigg children must play. All healthy children must play. Her mood suddenly changed. A softness shone on her face, and her eyes grew sad. It's a rather diabolical game, don't you think, Mrs. Drucker? And why not? Isn't life itself diabolical? For some of us, yes. A curious sympathy informed Vance's words as he gazed at this strange, tragic creature before us. Tell me, he went on quickly in an altered tone, do you know who the bishop is? The bishop? She frowned perplexedly. No, I don't know him. Is that another child's game? Something of that kind, I imagine. At any rate, the bishop is interested in Cock Robin and Johnny Sprigg. In fact, he may be the person who is making up these fantastic games. And we're looking for him, Mrs. Drucker. We hope to learn the truth from him. The woman shook her head vaguely. I don't know him. Then she glared vindictively at Markham. But it's not going to do you any good to try to find out who killed Cock Robin and shot Johnny Sprigg through the middle of his wig. You'll never learn. Never. Never. Her voice had risen excitedly, and a fit of trembling seized her. At this moment, Belle Dillard re-entered the room, and going quickly to Mrs. Drucker, put her arm about her. Come, she said soothingly, we'll have a long drive in the country, Lady May. Reproachfully, she turned to Markham and said coldly, Uncle wishes you to come to the library. With that, she led Mrs. Drucker from the room and down the hall. Now that's a queer one, sir, commented Heath, who had stood looking on with bewildered amazement. She had the dope on this Johnny Sprigg stuff all the time. Vance nodded. And our appearance here frightened her. Still, her mind is morbid and sensitive, Sergeant, and dwelling as she does constantly on her son's deformity and the early days when he was like other children, it's quite possible she merely hit accidentally upon the mother-goose significance of Robin's and Sprigg's death. I wonder. He looked toward Markham. There are strange undercurrents in this case, incredible and terrifying implications. It's like being lost in the Douvre troll caverns of Ibsen's Peer Gynt, where only monstrosities and abnormalities exist. He shrugged his shoulders, though I knew he had not wholly escaped the pall of horror cast on us by Mrs. Drucker's words. Perhaps we can find a little solid footing with Professor Dillard. The professor received us without enthusiasm and with but scant cordiality. His desk was littered with papers, and it was obvious that we had disturbed him in the midst of his labours. Why this unexpected visit, Markham? He asked, after we had seated ourselves. Have you something to report on Robin's death? He marked a page in Wales, Space, Time and Matter, and, settling back reluctantly, regarded us with impatience. I'm very busy working on a problem of Mark's mechanics. I regret, said Markham. I have nothing to report on the Robin case. But there has been another murder in this neighbourhood today, and we have reason to believe that it may be connected with Robin's death. What I wanted particularly to ask you, sir, is whether or not the name of John E. Sprigg is familiar to you. Professor Dillard's expression of annoyance changed quickly. Is that the name of the man who was killed? There was no longer any lack of interest in his attitude. Yes. A man named John E. Sprigg was shot in Riverside Park, near 84th Street, this morning shortly after 7:30. The professor's eyes wandered to the mantelpiece, and he was silent for several moments. He seemed to be debating inwardly some point that troubled him. Yes, he said at length. We do know a young man of that name, though it's wholly unlikely he's the same one. Who is he? Markham's voice was eagerly insistent. Again the professor hesitated. The lad I have in mind is Arneson's prize student in mathematics, what they'd call at Cambridge a senior wrangler. How do you happen to know him, sir? Arneson has brought him to the house here several times, wanted me to see him and talk to him. Arneson was quite proud of the boy, and I must admit he showed unusual talent. Then he was known to all the members of the household? Yes, Bell met him, I think, and if by the household you include Pine and Beadle, I should say the name was probably familiar to them too. Vance asked the next question. Did the Druckers know Sprigg, Professor Dillard? It's quite possible. Arneson and Drucker see each other a great deal. Come to think of it, I believe Drucker was here one night when Sprigg called. And Pardee, did he also know Sprigg? As to that, I couldn't say. The professor tapped impatiently on the arm of his chair and turned back to Markham. See here, his voice held a worried petulance. What's the point of these questions? What has our knowing a student named Sprigg to do with this morning's affair? Surely you don't mean to tell me that the man who was killed was Arneson's pupil? I'm afraid it's true, said Markham. There was a note of anxiety, of fear almost, I thought, in the professor's voice when he next spoke. Even so, what can that fact have to do with us? And how can you possibly connect his death with Robin's? I admit we have nothing definite to go on, Markham told him. But the purposelessness of both crimes, the total lack of any motive in either case, seems to give them a curious unity of aspect. You mean, of course, that you have found no motive, but if all crimes without apparent motive were assumed to be connected. Also, there are the elements of time and proximity in these two cases, Markham amplified. Is that the basis of your assumption? The professor's manner was benevolently contemptuous. You never were a good mathematician, Markham, but at least you should know that no hypothesis can be built on such a flimsy premise. Both names, interposed Vance, Cock Robin and Johnny Sprigg, are the subjects of well-known nursery rhymes. The old man stared at him with undisguised astonishment, and gradually an angry flush mounted to his face. Your humour, sir, is out of place. It is not my humour, alas, replied Vance sadly. The jest is the bishop's. The bishop! Professor Dillard strove to curb his irritation. Look here, Markham, I won't be played with. That's the second mention of a mysterious bishop that's been made in this room, and I want to know the meaning of it. Even if a crank did write an insane letter to the papers in connection with Robin's death, what has this bishop to do with Sprigg? A paper was found beneath Sprigg's body bearing a mathematical formula typed on the same machine as the bishop notes. What? The professor bent forward. The same machine, you say? And a mathematical formula. What was the formula? Markham opened his pocketbook and held out the triangular scrap of paper that Pitts had given him. The Riemann-Christoffel tensor. Professor Dillard sat for a long time gazing at the paper. Then he handed it back to Markham. He seemed suddenly to have grown older, and there was a weary look in his eyes as he lifted them to us. I don't see any light in this matter. His tone was one of hopeless resignation. But perhaps you are right in following your present course. What do you want of me? Markham was plainly puzzled by the other's altered attitude. I came to you primarily to ascertain if there was any link between Sprigg and this house. But to be quite candid, I don't see how that link, now that I have it, fits into the chain. I would, however, like your permission to question Pine and Beadle in whatever way I think advisable. Ask them anything you like, Markham. You shall never be able to accuse me of having stood in your way. He glanced up appealingly. But you will, I hope, advise me before you take any drastic steps. That I can promise you, sir. Markham rose. But I fear we are a long way from any drastic measures at present. He held out his hand, and from his manner it was evident he had sensed some hidden anxiety in the old man and wanted to express his sympathy without voicing his feelings. The professor walked with us to the door. I can't understand that typed tensor, he murmured, shaking his head. But if there's anything I can do— There is something you can do for us, Professor Dillard, said Vance, pausing at the door. On the morning Robin was killed, we interviewed Mrs. Drucker. Ah! And though she denied having sat at her window during the forenoon, there is a possibility she saw something happen on the archery range between 11 and 12. She gave you that impression? There was an undertone of suppressed interest in the professor's question. Only in a remote way. It was Drucker's statement that he had heard his mother scream, and her denial of having screamed, that led me to believe that she might have seen something she preferred to keep from us. and it occurred to me that you would probably have more influence with her than anyone else, and that, if she did indeed witness anything, you might prevail upon her to speak." "No." Professor Dillard spoke almost harshly, but he immediately placed his hand on Markham's arm, and his tone changed. "There are some things you must not ask me to do for you. If that poor harassed woman saw anything from her window that morning, you must find it out for yourself. I'll have no hand in torturing her, and I sincerely hope you'll not worry her either. There are other ways of finding out what you want to know." He looked straight into Markham's eyes. "She must not be the one to tell you. You yourself would be sorry afterwards." "We must find out what we can," Markham answered, resolutely but with kindliness. "There's a fiend loose in this city, and I cannot stay my hand to save anyone from suffering, however tragic that suffering may be. But I assure you, I shall not unnecessarily torture anyone." "Have you thought," asked Professor Dillard quietly, "that the truth you seek may be more frightful even than the crimes themselves?" "That I shall have to risk, but even if I knew it to be a fact, it would not deter me in any degree." "Certainly not. But Markham, I'm much older than you. I had grey hair when you were a lad, struggling with your logs and antilogs. And when one gets old, one learns the true proportions in the universe. The ratios all change. The estimates we once placed on things lose their meaning. That's why the old are more forgiving. They know that no man-made values are of any importance." "But as long as we must live by human values," argued Markham, "it is my duty to uphold them. And I cannot, through any personal sense of sympathy, refuse to take any avenue that may lead to the truth." "You are perhaps right," the professor sighed. "But you must not ask me to help you in this instance. If you learn the truth, be charitable. Be sure your culprit is accountable before you demand that he be sent to the electric chair. There are diseased minds as well as diseased bodies, and often the two go together." When we had returned to the drawing-room, Vance lighted a cigarette with more than his usual care. "The professor," he said, "is not at all happy about Sprigg's death, and though he won't admit it, that tensor formula convinced him that Sprigg and Robin belong to the same equation. But he was convinced dashed easily. Now why? Moreover, he didn't care to admit that Sprigg was known hereabouts. I don't say he has suspicions, but he has fears. Deuced funny, his attitude. He apparently doesn't want to obstruct the
Chapter
legal
4.
justice which you
A
uphold
mysterious
with such
note.
touching zeal, Markham.
Saturday,
But he
April
most
2nd,
decidedly
2
doesn't care
p.m.
to abet your crusade.
Markham
where
sat
the
down
Druckers are
resolutely
concerned.
before the centre
I
table.
wonder what's back of his consideration
Suppose, Sergeant,
for Mrs. Drucker.
we overhaul the
I
two
shouldn't
servants
say,
now.
offhand, that
Heath
the professor
stepped into
was
the
of a
hall and gave an
sentimental
order
nature.
to one of his men.
And what was
A
that
few moments
platitude
later,
about a
tall,
diseased mind
sombre,
and a diseased
disjointed
body?
man entered,
Sounded
and
like
stood
a
at
prospectus
respectful
for a physical
attention.
culture class.
"This is the
What?
butler, sir,"
Explained the
Lackaday.
sergeant.
Let's
Named
put a few
Pine.
questions to Pine
Markham
and Kin.
studied the man appraisingly.
Markham sat
He was
smoking
perhaps 60
moodily.
years old. I had
His
rarely
features
seen him
were
so
markedly
despondent.
acromegalic.
I
and
don't
his
see what we can
distortion
hope for
extended
from
to
them,
his entire
he commented.
figure. His
However,
hands
Sergeant,
were large,
get
and his
Pine in
feet
here.
broad and misshapen.
When Heath had
His
stepped
clothes,
out,
though
Vance
neatly
gave
pressed,
Markham a
fitted him
waggish
badly.
look, and his high clerical
Really,
collar
you
was
know,
several
you
sizes
shouldn't
too
reply.
large for him. Let Terence
His
console
eyes,
you.
beneath grey,
Niltam
bushy
difficile
eyebrows,
est,
were pale
queen
and
querendo
watery, and his
investigare
mouth was a
possit.
mere slit
And,
in an
on my
unhealthily
soul,
puffy face.
this is a difficult problem.
Despite his utter lack
He
of
became
physical
suddenly
prepossession,
sober.
however,
We're
gave
dealing
one
with
the
unknown
impression of
quantities
shrewd
here.
competency.
We're pitted against some
So you
strange,
are the Dillard
abnormal
butler,
force
mused
that doesn't
Markham.
operate
How
according to
long
the
have you been with
accepted
the
laws of
family,
conduct. It's at
Going on
once
10
subtle.
years, sir.
Oh, no end
You
subtle,
came then,
and
just after
unfamiliar.
Professor Dillard
But at
resigned his
least we
chair
know
at
that
the
it
university.
emanates from somewhere in the
I believe
environs
so,
of this
sir.
old house.
The man's
And we
voice
must
was
search
deep
in
and
every
rumbling.
psychological nook
What do you
and
know
cranny.
of the tragedy that
Somewhere
occurred
about
here
us
this morning?
lies the invisible dragon.
Though Markham put the
So
question
don't be
suddenly,
shocked at the
in
questions
the hope,
I shall
I
put to
imagine,
Pine.
of surprising
We
some
must look
admission.
in the most
Pine
unlikely
received
places.
it with the utmost stoicism.
Footsteps were heard approaching
Nothing
the
whatever,
archway,
sir.
and a moment
I was
later,
unaware that
Heath
anything had
entered
happened
with the old
until
butler
Professor
in tow.
Dillard called to me from the library and asked me to look for Mr. Spurling. He told you of the tragedy, then? He said, "Mr. Robin has been murdered, and I wish you'd find Mr. Spurling for me." That was all, sir. "You're sure he said murdered, Pine?" interjected Vance. For the first time, the butler hesitated, and an added astuteness crept into his look. "Yes, sir. I'm sure he did. Murdered is what he said."
And did you see the body of Mr. Robin when you pushed your search? Pursued Vance, his eyes idly tracing a design on the wall. Again, there was a brief hesitation. Yes, sir. I opened the basement door to look out on the archery range, and there I saw the poor young gentleman. A great shock it must have given you, Pine, Vance observed dryly. Did you, by any hap, touch the poor young gentleman's body? Or the arrow, perhaps? Or the bow? Pine's watery eyes glistened for a moment. No, of course not, sir. Why should I, sir? Why, indeed, Vance sighed wearily. But you saw the bow. The man squinted, as if for purposes of mental visualization. I couldn't say, sir. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. I don't recall. Vance seemed to lose all interest in him, and Markham resumed the interrogation. I understand, Pine, that Mr. Drucker called here this morning about 9:30. Did you see him? Yes, sir. He always uses the basement door, and he said good morning to me as he passed the butler's pantry at the head of the steps. He returned the same way he came. I suppose so, sir, though I was upstairs when he went. He lives in the house at the rear. I know. Markham leaned forward. I presume it was you who admitted Mr. Robin and Mr. Spurling this morning? Yes, sir, at about 10 o'clock. Did you see them again, or overhear any of their remarks while they waited here in the drawing-room? No, sir. I was busy in Mr. Arneson's quarters most of the morning. Ah! Vance turned his eyes on the man. That would be on the second floor rear, wouldn't it? The room with the balcony. Yes, sir. Most interesting. And it was from that balcony that Professor Dillard first saw Mr. Robin's body. How could he have entered the room without your knowing it? You said, I believe, that your first intimation of the tragedy was when the professor called you from the library and told you to seek Mr. Spurling. The butler's face turned a pasty white, and I noticed that his fingers twitched nervously. I might have stepped out of Mr. Arneson's room for a moment, he explained with effort. Yes, it's quite likely. In fact, sir, I recall going to the linen closet. Oh, to be sure. Vance lapsed into lethargy. Markham smoked a while, his gaze concentrated on the tabletop. Did anyone else call at the house this morning, Pine? He asked presently. No one, sir. And you can suggest no explanation for what happened here? The man shook his head heavily, his watery eyes in space. No, sir. Mr. Robin seemed a pleasant, well-liked young man. He wasn't the kind to inspire murder, if you understand what I mean. Vance looked up. I can't say that I, personally, understand exactly what you mean, Pine. How do you know it wasn't an accident? I don't, sir, was the unperturbed answer. But I know a bit about archery, if you'll pardon my saying so, and I saw right away that Mr. Robin had been killed by a hunting arrow. You're very observant, Pine, nodded Vance, and quite correct. It was plain that no direct information was to be got from the butler, and Markham dismissed him abruptly, at the same time ordering Heath to send in the cook. When she entered, I noticed at once a resemblance between father and daughter. She was a slatternly woman of about 40, also tall and angular, with a thin, elongated face and large hands and feet. Hyperpituitarism evidently ran in the Pine family. A few preliminary questions brought out the information that she was a widow named Beadle and had, at the death of her husband 5 years before, come to Professor Dillard as the result of Pine's recommendation. What time did you leave the house this morning, Beadle? Markham asked her. Right after 10:30. She seemed uneasy and on the alert, and her voice was defensively belligerent. And what time did you return? About 12:30. That man let me in. She looked viciously at Heath, and treated me like I'd been a criminal. Heath grinned. The time's okay, Mr. Markham. She got sore because I wouldn't let her go downstairs. Markham nodded non-committally. Do you know anything of what took place here this morning? He went on, studying the woman closely. How should I know? I was at Jefferson Market. Did you see either Mr. Robin or Mr. Spurling? They went downstairs to the archery room past the kitchen a little while before I went out. Did you overhear anything they said? I don't listen at keyholes. Markham set his jaw angrily and was about to speak when Vance addressed the woman suavely. The district attorney thought that perhaps the door was open and that you might have overheard some of their conversation despite your commendable effort not to listen. The door might have been open, but I didn't hear anything, she answered sullenly. Then you couldn't tell us if there was anyone else in the archery room. Beadle narrowed her eyes and gave Vance a calculating look. Maybe there was someone else, she said slowly. In fact, I thought I heard Mr. Drucker. A note of venom came into her voice, and the shadow of a hard smile passed over her thin lips. He was here to call on Mr. Arneson early this morning. Oh, was he now? Vance appeared surprised at this news. You saw him, perhaps? I saw him come in, but I didn't see him go out. Anyway, I didn't notice. He sneaks in and out at all hours. Sneaks, eh? Fancy that. By the by, which door did you use when you went to marketing? The front door. Since Miss Bell made a clubroom out of the basement, I always use the front door. Then you didn't enter the archery room this morning? No. Vance raised himself in his chair. Thanks for your help, Beadle. We won't need you any more now. When the woman had left us, Vance rose and walked to the window. We're expending too much zeal in irrelevant channels, Markham, he said. We'll never get anywhere by ballyragging servants and questioning members of the household. There's a psychological wall to be battered down before we can begin storming the enemy's trenches. Everybody in this menage has some pet privacy that he's afraid will leak out. Each person so far has told us either less or more than he knows. Disheartening, but true. Nothing that we've learned dovetails with anything else, and when chronological events don't fit together, you may rest assured that the serrated points of contact have been deliberately distorted. I haven't found one clean joinder in all the tales that have been poured into our ears. It's more likely the connections are missing, Markham argued, and we'll never find them if we don't pursue our questionings. You're much too trusting. Vance walked back to the center table. The more questions we ask, the farther afield we'll be taken. Even Professor Dillard didn't give us a wholly honest account. There's something he's keeping back, some suspicion he won't voice. Why did he bring that bow indoors? Arneson put his finger on a vital spot when he asked the same question. Shrewd fella, Arneson. Then there's our athletic young lady with the muscular calves. She's entangled in various amatory meshes and is endeavouring to extricate herself and her whole coterie without leaving a blemish on anyone. A praiseworthy aim, but not one conducive to the unadulterated truth. Pine has ideas too. That flabby facial mask of his curtains, many an entrancing thought. But we'll never probe his cortex by chivying him with questions. Something rum, too, about his matutinal labours. He says he was in Arneson's room all morning, but he obviously didn't know that the professor took a sun-in on Arneson's veranda. And that linen closet alibi, much too specious. Also, Markham, let your mind flutter about the widowed Beadle's tale. She doesn't like the over-sociable Mr. Drucker, and when she saw a chance to involve him, she did so. She thought she heard his voice in the archery room. But did she? Who knows? True, he might have tarried among the slings and javelins on his way home and been joined later by Robin and Spurling. Yes, it's a point we must investigate. In fact, a bit of polite converse with Mr. Drucker is strongly indicated. Footsteps were heard descending the front stairs, and Arneson appeared in the archway of the living room. Well, who killed Cock Robin? He asked, with a satyr-like grin. Markham rose, annoyed, and was about to protest at the intrusion, but Arneson held up his hand. One moment, please. I'm here to offer my exalted services in the noble cause of justice. Mundane justice, I would have you understand. Philosophically, of course, there's no such thing as justice. If there really were justice, we'd all be in for a shingling in the cosmic woodshed. He sat down facing Markham and chuckled cynically. The fact is, the sad and precipitate departure of Mr. Robin appeals to my scientific nature. It makes a nice, orderly problem. It has a decidedly mathematical flavour. No undistributed terms, you understand. Clear-cut integers with certain unknown quantities to be determined. Well, I'm the genius to solve it. What would be your solution, Arneson? Markham knew and respected the man's intelligence, and seemed at once to sense a serious purpose beneath his attitude of sneering flippancy. Ah, as yet, I haven't tackled the equation. Arneson drew out an old briar pipe and fingered it affectionately. But I've always wanted to do a little detective work on a purely earthly plane, the insatiable curiosity and natural inquisitiveness of the physicist, you understand. And I've long had a theory that the science of mathematics can be advantageously applied to the trivialities of our life on this unimportant planet. There's nothing but law in the universe, unless Eddington is right, and there's no law at all, and I see no sufficient reason why the identity and position of a criminal can't be determined just as Leverrier calculated the mass and ephemeris of Neptune from the observed deviations in the orbit of Uranus. You remember how, after his computations, he told Galle, the Berlin astronomer, to look for the planet in a specified longitude of the ecliptic. Arneson paused and filled his pipe. Now, Mr. Markham, he went on, and I tried to decide whether or not the man was in earnest. I'd like the opportunity of applying to this absurd muddle the purely rational means used by Leverrier in discovering Neptune. But I've got to have the data on the perturbations of Uranus's orbit, so to speak. That is, I must know all the varying factors in the equation. The favor I've come here to ask is that you take me into your confidence and tell me all the facts. A sort of intellectual partnership. I'll figure out this problem for you along scientific lines. It'll be bully sport, and incidentally, I'd like to prove my theory that mathematics is the basis of all truth, however far removed from scholastic abstractions. He at last got his pipe going, and sank back in his chair. Is it a bargain? I'll be glad to tell you whatever we know, Arneson, Markham replied after a brief pause. But I can't promise to reveal everything that may arise from now on. It might work against the ends of justice and embarrass our investigation. Vance had sat with half-closed eyes, apparently bored by Arneson's astonishing request, but now he turned to Markham with a considerable show of animation. I say, you know, there's really no reason why we shouldn't give Mr. Arneson a chance to translate this crime into the realm of applied mathematics. I'm sure he'd be discreet and use our information only for scientific purposes. And one never knows, does one? We may need his highly trained assistance before we're through with this fascinating affair. Markham knew Vance well enough to realize that his suggestion had not been made thoughtlessly, and I was in no wise astonished when he faced Arneson and said, "Very well, then. We'll give you whatever data you need to work out your mathematical formula. Anything special you want to know now?" "Oh, no. I know the details thus far as well as you, and I'll strip Beadle and Old Pine of their contributions when you're gone. But if I solve this problem and determine the exact position of the criminal, don't pigeonhole my findings as Sir George Airy did those of poor Adams when he submitted his Neptunian calculations prior to Leverrier's." At this moment, the front door opened, and the uniformed officer stationed on the porch came in, followed by a stranger. "This gent here says he wants to see the professor," he announced with radiating suspicion, and turning to the man he indicated Markham with a gesture of the head. "That's the district attorney. Tell him your troubles." The newcomer seemed somewhat embarrassed. He was a slender, well-groomed man with an unmistakable air of refinement. His age, I should say, was 50, though his face held a perennially youthful look. His hair was thin and greying, his nose a trifle sharp, and his chin small but in no way weak. His eyes, surmounted by a high, broad forehead, were his most striking characteristic. They were the eyes of a disappointed and disillusioned dreamer, half sad, half resentful, as if life had tricked him and left him unhappy and bitter. He was about to address Markham when he caught sight of Arneson. "Oh, good morning, Arneson," he said, in a quiet, well-modulated voice. "I hope there's nothing seriously wrong." "A mere death, pardee," the other replied carelessly. "The proverbial tempest in a teapot." Markham was annoyed at the interruption. "What can I do for you, sir?" he asked. "I trust I am not intruding," the man apologized. "I am a friend of the family. I live just across the street, and I perceived that something unusual had happened here. It occurred to me I might be of some service. Arneson chuckled. My dear Pardee, why clothe your natural curiosity in the habiliments of rhetoric? Pardee blushed. I assure you, Arneson, he began, but Vance interrupted him. You say you live opposite, Mr. Pardee. You have perhaps been observing this house during the forenoon. Hardly that, sir. My study, however, overlooks 75th Street, and it's true I was sitting at the window most of the morning, but I was busy writing. When I returned to my work from lunch, I noticed the crowd and the police cars, and also the officer in uniform at the door. Vance had been studying him from the corner of his eye. Did you happen to see anyone enter or leave this house this morning, Mr. Pardee? He asked. The man shook his head slowly. No one in particular. I noticed two young men, friends of Miss Dillard, call at about 10 o'clock, and I saw Beadle go out with her market basket, but that's all I recall. Did you see either of these young men depart? I don't remember. Pardee knit his brows, and yet it seems to me one of them left by the range gate. But it's only an impression. What time would that have been? Really? I couldn't say. Perhaps an hour or so after his arrival. I wouldn't care to be more specific. You recall no other person whatever, either coming or going from the house this morning? I saw Miss Dillard return from the tennis courts about 12:30, just as I was called to lunch. In fact, she waved her racket to me. And no one else? I'm afraid not. There was unmistakable regret in his quiet response. One of the young men you saw enter here has been killed, Vance told him. Mr. Robin, alias Cock Robin, supplemented Arneson, with a comic grimace which affected me unpleasantly. Good heavens, how unfortunate! Pardee appeared genuinely shocked. Robin? Wasn't he the champion archer of Bell's club? His one claim to immortality. That's the chap. Poor Bell. Something in the man's manner caused Vance to regard him sharply. I hope she's not too greatly upset by the tragedy. She's dramatizing it, naturally, Arneson returned. So are the police, for that matter. Awful pother about nothing in particular. The earth is covered with small crawling masses of impure carbohydrates like Robin, referred to in the aggregate as humanity. Pardee smiled with tolerant sadness. He was obviously familiar with Arneson's cynicisms. Then he appealed to Markham. May I be permitted to see Miss Dillard and her uncle? Oh, by all means. It was Vance who answered before Markham could reach a decision. You'll find them in the library, Mr. Pardee. The man left the room with a polite murmur of thanks. Queer fellow, commented Arneson when Pardee was out of hearing. Cursed with money, leads an indolent life. His one passion is solving chess problems. Chess? Vance looked up with interest. Is he, by any chance, John Pardee, the inventor of the famous Pardee Gambit? The same. Arneson's face crinkled humorously. Spent 20 years developing a cast-iron offensive that was to add new decimal points to the game. Wrote a book about it, then went forth proselytizing like a crusader before the gates of Damascus. He's always been a great patron of chess, contributing to tournaments and scurrying round the world to attend the various chess jousting bouts. Consequently, was able to get his gambit tested. It made a great stir among the infra-champions of the Manhattan Chess Club. Then poor Pardee organized a series of masters tournaments, paid all the expenses himself, cost him a fortune, by the way. And of course he stipulated that the Pardee Gambit be played exclusively. Well, it was very sad. When men like Dr. Lasker and Capablanca and Rubinstein and Finn got to combating it, it went to pieces. Almost every player who used it lost. It was disqualified, even worse than the ill-fated Rice Gambit. Terrible blow for Pardee. It put snow in his hair and took all the rubber out of his muscles. Aged him, in short. He's a broken man. I know the history of the Gambit, murmured Vance, his eyes resting pensively on the ceiling. I've used it myself. Edward Lasker 9 taught it to me. The uniformed officer again appeared in the archway and beckoned to Heath. The sergeant rose with alacrity, The ramifications of chess obviously bored him and went into the hall. A moment later, he returned bearing a small sheet of paper. "Here's a funny one, sir," he said, handing it to Markham. "The officer outside happened to see it sticking out of the mailbox just now and thought he'd take a peep at it. What do you make of it, sir?" Markham studied it with puzzled amazement and then, without a word, handed it to Vance. I rose and looked over his shoulder. The paper was of the conventional typewriter size and had been folded to fit into the mailbox. It contained several lines of typing done on a machine with elite characters and a faded blue ribbon. The first line read, "Joseph Cochrane Robin is dead." The second line asked, "Who killed Cock Robin?" Underneath was typed, "Spurling means sparrow," and in the lower right-hand corner, the place of the signature, were the two words, in capitals, "The Bishop."